Hey, welcome back, guys. This is session number 34 of our exploration of the Gospel of Mark. And we're going to jump right into chapter number 10 in this session. And we're going to look at a text that has actually impacted a lot of people in our nation, in our world. It is about divorce. And a lot of people understand the implications of what Jesus is talking about in this text when he talks about divorce and how it can have a negative impact on families, on people. And we're going to look at it. And I understand that a lot of people may be impacted by this. And so this session may get a little bit heavy, but I think also understanding what Jesus is saying in this text actually helps us to free ourselves, even if we have been personally impacted by divorce in our lives. So let's go ahead and dive right into the text. The text says, "And he left there and went to the region of Judea and beyond the Jordan, and crowds gathered to him again. And again, as was his custom, he taught them." Now, let's go ahead and look at this first section here where it says that he left there and went to the region of Judea and beyond the Jordan. Now, where is there? Where is he leaving from? And what is this region of Judea that is beyond the Jordan? First of all, the Greek word translated beyond there is actually Peiron. Peiron. And it literally means across the Jordan River. So let's look at what that looks like by turning to our trusty little map, the one we've been using our entire time together. So there is Capernaum, right? This is where Jesus is actually coming from on the north side of the Sea of Galilee. And remember, Jesus was teaching the disciples about greatness and the right posture to have in ministry when he's in Capernaum, which is home base for him. Then he moves further south in the text. It says across the Jordan. So as he's moving south, apparently he crosses the Jordan here into this land over here, which is called Perea. And that's where you get that Greek word. Now, interesting thing you need to know about Perea, we're going to talk about a little bit later, but this is where John the Baptist encountered the Herodian dynasty, King Herod, and something happened to John as he encountered that Herodian dynasty that's going to help you understand the text that we're looking at. So we'll get to that a little bit later. But Jesus is now intentionally, as we'll see, making his way somewhere. As he closes out his journey, he's journeying down here to Jerusalem and ultimately to the cross. But he passes through Perea here and encounters some Pharisees. The closer you get to Jerusalem, the more religious leaders there are. So he's encountering some Pharisees here in this region. And let's look at what happens as they come to him. And the Pharisees came up in order to test him and asked, "Is it lawful for a man to divorce his wife?" They came up to him. Why? To test him. They had one purpose in mind for that question that they asked him, and that is to test Jesus or to tempt Jesus. And what is the question they ask? Is it lawful for a man to divorce his wife? Now, here's what they already knew. Now, the Jews, especially the Pharisees, are really good law-abiding people. They know the law. So they're going to ask him a question. Is something lawful? Why would a Pharisee who knows the law ask Jesus about the law? They were experts in the law. So why would they ask that question? Well, Matthew adds some clarity and is likely closer to what the Pharisees is getting at. In his text, he says this, and that's in Matthew 19:3. He says, "Is it lawful to divorce one's wife for any cause?" See, they wanted him to chime in what was a controversy in the first century. The conservative school had one thought on this, and then the liberal school, sounds like politics these days, right, had a different perspective on this. And what were the two perspectives? Well, The conservative school thought that this passage in Leviticus that said a man could divorce his wife for quote unquote indecency, they translated that to mean that he could divorce her only for adultery, right? There was one thing that he could divorce her for. That was the indecency that is said there in that passage. Well, the liberal school, they had a much more liberal perspective on divorce. They said that he could divorce her for any reason up to and including her cooking. I'm not making this up. If she cooked some bad food, he would be able to divorce her. That's just crazy. But so the Pharisees here, their implied question here is, could a man divorce a woman on any grounds besides adultery? Because we know what the conservative school says, but how close can we get over here without stepping over the line when it comes to divorce? Now, remember earlier that Mark had mentioned a certain situation where King Herod, right, he beheaded John. Why? Because John had a specific view on marriage, and Herod had taken his brother's wife. And John said, no, we can't have this. This is not what is written in the law. And he lost his head, lost his life, because Herod did not like John's perspective on divorce and remarriage. This was what was going on here in this text. And they're in the region where Herod and John had that encounter. So they're probably trying to trap Jesus in his words, because knowing his answer could be a more conservative type answer, it might lead him to come up against this Herodian dynasty that actually already didn't like John and was trying to figure out who this Jesus was. So the Pharisees are actually trying to put Jesus in some hot water here. In Leviticus 21:7, you can take a look at that. It says that the priest actually couldn't marry a divorced woman. This was how big this issue was. So anybody who was a priest couldn't marry a woman who was divorced. Look how Jesus answers them. He says, what did Moses command you? And they said, Moses allowed a man to write a certificate of divorce and send her away. So there was this commandment, right, that Moses wrote that said that he could divorce his wife through a certificate of divorce. So Jesus turns where? He turns to Moses and asks what Moses commands them, because he knows that they respect Moses. And they give him that answer. They say, hey, he can write a certificate of divorce. And that appears in Deuteronomy 24:1-4, if you want to look at the divorce code in Deuteronomy. Now, what does that mean? Well, Jesus says to them, well, here's why he did that. Because of the hardness of your hearts, he wrote you this commandment. But from the beginning of creation, God made them male and female. Now, this is huge here. This is big. Why? Because Jesus is saying something. He's saying this commandment or this permission that Moses gives you is actually because you were hard-hearted, that he had to put this in place because he knew the hearts of men. He knew that you guys were going to mess up this covenant of marriage, so that he had to put this divorce thing into place to actually protect women, because he had to actually write a certificate of divorce. He had to go through a process in order to do this. And see, Jesus here is actually referencing something in creation in Genesis 1:27. What does it say? So God created man in his own image. In the image of God, he created him, male and female. He created them, right? So he's going back to the beginning of creation and he's saying, this is not how it always was. There was a time where marriage was sacred and there was a covenant. And because that covenant was broken, and because of the hardness of your hearts, we had to put this code of divorce in here. But don't look at the code. Don't look at the code. And how does he go further to say that? He says this. You're looking at this all wrong, folks. You really are. Like, I love what one commentary says here. It says, you don't learn about flying by studying instructions on the crash landing. That's what the Pharisees are doing here in this text. They are studying the crash sites rather than studying the beauty of the friendly skies that is marriage. That's why Jesus appeals to the beginning of creation. He's saying, here is God's purpose for you. You guys are sitting here arguing over something that is on the totally other end of the spectrum, divorce. I want to point you back to marriage. I want to point you back to the flying and not the crash site. Therefore, he says, a man shall leave his father and mother and hold fast to his wife, and the two shall become one flesh. So they are no longer two, but one flesh. Here's the key moment in this text, I believe. This section that says the two shall become one flesh. In divorce law, think about it. Who has all the power in that code? The man, right? He has a power to actually write a certificate of divorce. And why is that? Because of the fallen nature, Jesus says. He's able to do that because he knows that men are going to desire stuff outside of their marriage in their context. They're a very polygamous culture. So this man could write a certificate of divorce, and the woman's place in that culture was actually based on her relationship to a man. And Jesus steps right into this picture and in this culture and actually blows up the spot. He affirms the maleness and femaleness, right, of man and woman, but removes the actual subjection of woman to man. He says the two shall become one flesh, equals. And Jesus says here that a man's obligation to his wife is actually far more greater than his obligation to his father and to his mother, which in Jewish culture actually was huge. It was a huge obligation. You had to take care of your mom and your dad. In fact, Jewish folks considered the commandment to honor your parents second only to the commandment to honor God. And you can see that in Exodus 20:12, right? Okay, so what does all this mean? Jesus ties it all together here. What therefore God has joined together, let no man through a certificate of divorce or otherwise separate. Because no longer is a man the Lord over his marriage through this code, but God actually takes his rightful place as Lord when we understand the ideal situation of a covenant marriage covered by God, right? They had asked about what Moses permitted. Well, what does Jesus do here? He turns to what actually God commanded. He joined these people together. So don't look to what Moses permitted, but look to what God has commanded in Scripture. And then the disciples turn around in the house. Again, always a teaching moment in the house in Scripture, in Mark's gospel. The disciples asked them again about this matter. And later on, Jesus is going to go and explain this a little bit deeper to them. But I want to offer you one takeaway here. And I believe this is a beautiful picture. The Christian marriage is one of the signs in this world that actually points to Christ. Now, if you're married, I want you to keep this in mind. I want you to ask these questions. How is my marriage honoring Christ? Going back to that flying analogy, right? When it comes to my marriage, am I enjoying this flight with joy rather than focusing on that turbulence that comes from time to time? Am I really enjoying the friendly skies that God set up in Genesis to have man and woman become one flesh? And if you aren't married, your singleness, I believe, is still a sign. Some of the most effective people in ministry in Scripture were single, including Jesus and Paul, right? But what Jesus is saying here, he's saying, don't look at the crash sites. Don't focus on those crash sites. Don't focus on the divorce, but focus on the beauty of marriage and who it ultimately points to, because Paul talks about this later when he talks about the church being Christ's bride. So as a husband, what does that mean for me? It means that I'm supposed to love my wife as Christ loved the church. What an amazing picture. And not only an amazing picture, but a wonderful responsibility for me as husband to love my wife as Christ loved the church. So that the Christian marriage is one of the signs in this world that I believe points to Christ. So I need to ask that question. You need to ask that question if you're married and say, how is my marriage pointing other people to Jesus? All right, folks, that's been session number 34 of our exploration of the Gospel of Mark. I hope it was edifying for you. I know it was a tough topic, couldn't really tackle it as much as we could in the time that we had, but I just pray that it was a blessing to you all. Next go round, we're up on session number 35. Can't wait. Grace and peace.